Today, I'm going to show you how to set up OAuth using Google as the identity provider. I'm going to run through and do this using Next.js and Next-Auth, but auth.js, the library that Next-Auth comes from, can be used with additional frameworks. So if you're using a different framework, feel free to use auth.js, and the rest of this guide is going to be basically the same. With that, let's go ahead and dive in. Before we get into the code, I want to give you a 2-minute overview of OAuth and how it works. This is going to provide a lot of context for what we're about to do and how it's going to work at a high level. I'm not going to talk about the exact HTTP requests. Those differ between OAuth 1 and OAuth 2, but this is a high level that should provide the context you need. The first thing we have is a user, and the user is going to show up and they're going to want to use your application. And your application in the context of OAuth is known as the service provider, or SP for short. And so the user is going to want to access the service provider. Now your service provider doesn't know the identity of the user. So the user is going to select one of the identity providers. These are things like GitHub, Google, Twitter, X, whatever. The user is going to select one that they want to log in with, and the identity provider is going to identify the user. So let's say they do Google, because that's our example. And so now they're going to be redirected to the identity provider. In this case, Google. And so here, Google is going to know what your app is. Google has to know what the name is. Google has to know what the permissions you're requesting are. Google has to know all of these things. Now, when the user shows up on the Google identity provider, they're going to be asked to log in. Now, most people aren't going to have to do this step because they're already logged into Google. This is one of the nice things about using a well-known identity provider is that most of the time they're already logged in, so they don't need to explicitly do this step. And then the user needs to accept, reject, or do fine-grained control on what permissions they are allowing your app, the service provider, to get. Most of the time, this is an all or nothing, although some providers let you have like fine-grained control and explicitly allow or disallow certain things. Once the user has done that, then the identity provider redirects the user back to the service provider, your app, and says, here's the user information, here's the user profile, and these are the permissions that you have access to that the user has granted. Now, as part of this flow, if the user rejects it, either they don't log in or they reject your permissions, they'll also get kicked back to your app with a rejection message saying the user did not complete the flow, and then your app's going to have to handle that too. What we have to do now is create our application with Google so Google knows the permissions we need and all the configuration for our app. To do that, we head to the Google Cloud Console. To get to the Google Cloud Console, go ahead to console.cloud.google.com, and this will bring you right in. If you've never done this before, you might need to sign up and actually create your Cloud Console. But once you've done all that, you should land on a landing page like this. Now, I'm in my own organization because this is a Google Apps account. You might not have this exact thing if you're doing a Gmail, which is a regular Google account. One thing to note is that I've done a lot of work in Google, in AWS, and Azure, and Google's Cloud Console is not intuitive, okay? So if you get lost here or confused, it's not you, trust me. The first thing you're gonna wanna do is you're going to want to create a new project. I get here either by clicking this drop down up here, or you can click it right here and create new project. The project is going to house all of the APIs you need, all of the resources. So make sure that this is like a new unique thing for whatever project you're working on. For this, let's call it Google OAuth YouTube because, well, that's what we got. And then they're going to give you some weird identifier, whatever, that doesn't matter too much. With that, you can select an organization or location, the defaults are fine, and go ahead and click create. This is going to take a little bit of time, hopefully shouldn't take too long. All right, now it's been created so we can select the project. Welcome to your project dashboard. There's a lot of data here and a lot of it you probably don't need. This can be very useful if you're using a lot of Google APIs, and it's going to show you your usage, if you have any problems going on, what your billing is, and all of that. For us, we're just setting up OAuth, and so we only need to use a very small subset of this entire Google dashboard. Go ahead and jump into APIs and services. And the first thing we're going to want to do is go to the OAuth consent screen. You can set up OAuth with one of two ways within Google. One is you can have an internal app. So because I'm in an organization, this is an option. You might not even have this as a specific option when you do it. Internal means only available to users within the organization. This is really nice if you're working on an internal app for a company and your company already has Google accounts for everybody. For us, we're going to do external. This is available to anyone with a Google account. Now, because it's external, there are additional checks and balances that you have to do before you can make it really, really public. But this will make it available for anybody on the internet. Let's go ahead and create it. So here we need to supply your app information. This is what's going to be shown to the user when they go to the allow your application to access this user's data screen. So again, for here, we can do Google OAuth YouTube. This is going to be an email that you have access to, right? So it should be your email. Here you can upload your app logo. If you change this later, your app might need to be re-reviewed, but it's also not necessary if we're just setting this up to do some light testing. For the app domain, you're going to want to provide your homepage, privacy, and terms of service link. These should be real links to real products and real pages. But for now, we'll just pretend like we're running this all on localhost. And then we have the authorized domains. The authorized domains are required when you have your application shipped to production. So for right now, we don't need to do anything here because the only domain we're using is localhost. This should be your email again. And save and continue. Scopes are how you request permission for your application. You should always request as few permissions as possible because if you ask for everything, it's going to scare a lot of users away. Google has a couple of different types of scopes. Non-sensitive scopes are scopes that they deem something that a lot of applications are going to ask for and they can't do any real harm with them. These are all very common and they're all read-only. Sensitive scopes allow you to access private user information, and some sensitive scopes let you even change some information. Restricted scopes are even more sensitive, and you should only ask for that if you absolutely need them. So for here, we're going to add or remove scopes. Here are all of the scopes for everything Google has to offer. There are lots and lots and lots of these scopes. However, to get started, you really only need 3. This is you associate you and your profile with Google, the user info profile, and the user info email. So these are like the bare minimum I suggest to get in order to be able to correctly create your user and identify them and get something useful like the email. Go ahead and click update at the bottom, and then you'll have your scopes listed here. Go ahead and save and continue. And now you're going to want to add test users. Now, if you're doing an internal app, you don't need to do this. But because we marked ours as external, we need to say what users we can log in with. For now, I'll go ahead and add myself. This UI is a little tricky. If you just click add here, it doesn't actually work. You have to click off it first, then click add, and then it shows up. Once you've added whatever user you want to test with, I recommend testing with the user you sign up with, and then also one additional user to make sure it works well. Go ahead and save and continue here. And we get our summary of what we just did. With that, we can go back to the dashboard. So that's creating the OAuth consent screen. But now we have to go through and actually explicitly set up the application details that our app is going to be using. This is going to include where requests are coming from and what the redirect URIs are. So to do that, go to credentials here, and we're going to create new credentials. And this is going to be the OAuth client ID. When we create this, we can select what type of application we have. In this case, it's a web app. And you can give this an exam as well. This will be example content app. I recommend using the same name, whatever you pick. You want to do here whatever JavaScript origin your page lives on. So this is going to be, for testing, localhost 3000. And then in production, it's going to be the domain you're using in production. For the authorized redirect URI, this is also going to be localhost 3000 for testing, but then it's going to be explicitly the callback URI that Google is going to send you back to. We're using Next-Auth for this, so that's going to look like API auth callback Google, because this is the Google provider. Go ahead and click create. And here you get your client ID and client secret. We're going to take these and toss them into our app as environment variables. And before I post the video, we're going to delete all of this so it is secure. You can also download the JSON if you want to have a hard copy lying around. However, we just need the ID and the secret. And with that, we're done with the Google Cloud Console, and we can jump into the code. Here, I have a brand new Next.js project, and I've only done a couple of things to get us started. I've installed the Prisma client and Prisma, which I'm simply using as an ORM. You can use whatever you want, including Supabase or some other ORM. And then we also have installed Next-Auth, which is what we're going to use to wire up the authentication. For Prisma, I have a simple user model here with an ID, email, name, an optional avatar, and then simply created that and updated that. Most of my other tutorials will have a tenant, which I recommend as a higher level. But for here and this, we just simply have a user that we'll create in our database. From here, we simply set up Next-Auth and use it with Google. Go ahead and create a new file. And this is going to be API auth, Next-Auth, and then route.ts. This is in the app directory. If you're using the pages directory, the name is a little different, but the content should be very similar. The first thing we're going to want to do is read out the environment variables that we're going to want to set. So this is the Google client ID and the Google client secret. We're going to use that for the Google provider. Next, we're going to run through and set up the Next-Auth options and configure Next-Auth. Here we're going to use a JWT session strategy, which works fantastic with OAuth. You don't need to keep around session tokens or save anything to a database. All you have to do is give your users their JWT, and when that expires, they can re-log in again. Then we're going to set up the Google provider and passing in the client ID and the client secret. Again, these are read from the environment and we're passing them to the provider. Pretty straightforward. Now we're going to configure some callbacks. Now the callback we mostly care about is the sign in callback. This is going to be called when the user signs in with their Google account and are redirected back to our application. When that happens, we need to look at the information Google gives us and then decide if this user already exists and update it, or if we need to create a brand new user and save it to our database. Here is the sign in callback. And the first thing I like to do is check to see if we have the information. In this case, we're looking up the email and the profile. And if that wasn't provided, we can't do anything because that's the unique key we're using to look up our user. And then the next thing we need to do is use the magic of upsert to either create or update the user. So here we're awaiting Prisma user upsert, and we're checking based off of the profile email, which we know we have because we checked up here to make sure we had it. Now, if we don't have it, we're going to create a new user, passing in the email and their name. Otherwise, if we did find the user, we're going to update the name with a profile. This way, if the user changes their profile name on Google and they re-log in to the application, you can update their name in the application here. Lastly, return true for the sign-in, and that's all you have to do. Lastly, after all that, we need to make sure that we are exporting the information, and we should be good to test. So on the home page, what I'm going to do here is delete all this. And because this is a server component by default, we can look up the user session, and then we'll simply display what it is. And if nothing is there, it'll be null, and that's fine too. Before we can test this, we have to create our environment file with those environment variables we got from Google. So here we have the secret, the ID, our Next-Auth URL, which is whatever root domain the website is hosted on, and you want to pass in the Next-Auth secret. In this case, it can just be secret, something useful for local testing. So here you want your Google Client ID and Google Client secret. Make sure you get these in the right order. Now we can test. All right, so we currently have no session, which is perfect. Now if we go to API auth sign in, it's going to bring us to the default Next-Auth sign-in page. We click sign in with Google. This is going to send us to Google as the identity provider. All right, so here we have to sign in. Because this is my developer environment, I currently don't have an account signed in, so I can go ahead and sign in. Remember, this has to be the user you set up as a test user. Sign in, and there we go. We didn't even have to go through the OAuth consent screen, and now our user actually has a session created. Let's go ahead and fix that awful background. So once we signed in, we went through the OAuth process where Google validated our profile and then sent back the information. And so we got our name, email, and an image associated with our profile. Now remember, we had a Prisma upsert user in our database. So if we go ahead and check out our database and refresh, here we have my user that was created with the information we got from Google. Fantastic. Successfully set up Google OAuth to use with our application and tested it end to end locally. Now, what you're probably going to want to do is be able to do this on production as well. So when you move your app to production, there are a couple of things that we have to do to update the OAuth configuration to make sure it also works in prod. Let's say you have your project hosted on Vercel. This could be any other host that you want. The important thing is that you have a production domain name. So let's run through and make sure we have production set up so it works the same way as it does locally. First thing you want to do is make sure you know what your production URL is. In this case, it'll be this guy. This can be whatever you have configured. So let's go ahead, copy that. Open up settings. I like to do this in a new tab. And this is going to be our Next-Auth URL. Make sure this is the full thing, HTTPS, and the full URL that you have for Next-Auth. Then what you can do is you can go ahead and copy the rest of the environment variables and paste them all into this field. Now, instead of secret here, you're going to want to pick something like something long and complex, and that is actually a secret. And make sure you have your Google Client secret and ID as well. Now, these don't need to be set in development, but you probably want them set in the preview environments and production. Go ahead and click save, and now you have the 4 environment variables added to your project. Now, in order for these to take effect, we have to go ahead and redeploy the application. But before we do that, let's head back to the Google console. In the Google console, we need to update the client to say we have additional authorized JavaScript origins. The first one goes here, and that's going to be whatever your domain is. And then we also want to make sure we add a new redirect URI, and that's going to have the same route, but it's going to have the updated domain. So go ahead and click save. Note that it can take a couple of minutes for this to go into effect, so feel free to take a small break before testing this out. If you are running through this end to end, make sure that you have a Postgres database or whatever database you're using set up to work in production already. And then add the database URL into your environment. So now we should be able to sign in with Google, and this is going to do the full OAuth process. And because I don't have a database, we're gonna skip that real quick, and we should have our JWT given, and we should be logged in. Voila. Just like that, we have the same thing, our name, profile, image. This is the session information that we're getting from Next.Auth, and it shows we've gone through that sign-in process and we've logged into our application. I hope this was useful for you as you go through and set up OAuth. The Google Cloud Console can be a little confusing, but otherwise the whole flow is relatively straightforward. Let me know if you want to see other providers. I'm planning on doing a couple more to set it up. And otherwise, if you liked this, give it a like and subscribe. And until next time, happy coding.